They say respect is free, but tonight I watched a woman sell her soul for the price of her pride. The hush of expensive leather shoes against the marble floor, the faint clinking of crystal glasses under soft chandelier light. La Lumiere was a kingdom of silent judgments. Shaquille O'Neal stood at the entrance, his towering frame cloaked not in designer silk, but in a simple gray t-shirt and worn sneakers. He carried no armor of brand names, no shield of diamond watches, only a quiet confidence that made the room hold its breath. Eyes shifted. Whispers curled through the air like cigarette smoke. Emma Carter stood at the host's stand, her spine straight as a blade, her polished smile already twisted beneath her skin. "Are you sure you want to eat here?" Her words slid across the room, slicing into the delicate hum of dinner conversations. Shaq smiled, a calm sea against her sharp rocks. "Yes, I'd like to try the experience." A pause. A flick of her eyes down his outfit, like a queen inspecting a stray dog at her gates. "Follow me," she finally said, her voice dripping with honeyed poison. He moved slowly behind her, his steps a gentle echo in the golden corridor of tables dressed in white linen. Each table flickered with candlelight and unspoken judgments. Emma led him past the prime seats, past the violinist gently stroking a melody no one truly heard, past the silent nods of men in pressed suits and women in shimmering gowns. She stopped at a corner table by the kitchen doors, where the smell of dishwater bled into the expensive perfume of the dining hall. "This should match your style perfectly," she said, dropping the menu like a gauntlet. Shaq sat, unbothered. His hands rested lightly on the table as though he were listening to an orchestra only he could hear. Emma lingered, waiting for a flinch, a crack, a drop of sweat. Nothing. Around them, eyes darted, forks paused midair. A young woman in a red dress watched, her lips parted in silent protest. An older gentleman shook his head slowly, wine glass trembling between his fingers. Shaq opened the menu, his fingers gliding over the pages as if they were love letters. His eyes rose to meet Emma's, unwavering. "I'll have the filet mignon Rossini," he said, as calm as a monk in a storm. Her smirk faltered, twisting into something brittle and desperate. She turned sharply, her heels clicking away like gunshots in a church. Shaq leaned back, his breath steady, his eyes soft. Tonight he wasn't just ordering dinner. Tonight he was about to teach a room full of strangers, and one woman blinded by her own armor, the true price of dignity. They say you can tell a person's worth by the shoes they wear. But tonight, the man with the most worn-out sneakers in the room was about to hold every soul captive without saying a word. La Lumiere glowed under 1,000 tiny lights. Crystal chandeliers spilled liquid gold onto tables dressed in pristine white. Waiters floated like shadows, refilling glasses of Bordeaux and whispering tonight's specials with hushed reverence. In that temple of elegance, a giant walked in, Shaquille O'Neal. Over 7 feet of quiet storms and hidden warmth. He wore a plain gray t-shirt, sweatpants, and those scuffed sneakers that looked like they had traveled through every city street and heartbreak in America. Heads turned, wine glasses paused midair. Some recognized him instantly, the legend, the unstoppable force on the court. Others saw only a man out of place. In a world where a tailored suit was the unspoken password, Shaq carried himself like he owned an entirely different universe. At the host stand stood Emma Carter. Her black dress hugged her frame like polished steel. Her hair was twisted into a perfect bun, her lips painted a shade that warned you not to cross her. She scanned Shaq's clothes, her eyes flicking over each crease, each threadbare edge with a surgeon's cold precision. "Good evening," Shaq said, his voice deep and calm, as if he were greeting an old friend on a porch at sunset. "I'd like a table, please." Emma's smile was a blade hidden in velvet. "This is La Lumiere, sir," she said, her tone light but her words dipped in acid. "Are you sure this is the experience you're looking for?" Shaq nodded, unfazed. "Yes, I believe so." She blinked once, twice. Then she turned, her heels clicking like impatient metronomes on the marble. "Follow me." They moved through the dining room, past rows of couples in shimmering gowns and sleek tuxedos. Conversations stuttered and died in their wake, like candles snuffed by an invisible hand. Emma never looked back at him. Her steps were too sharp, too precise, as if each one was meant to puncture the silence around them. Finally, she stopped at a lonely table near the swinging kitchen doors, where the soft clang of pans and the sharp smell of garlic leaked into the air. "This should suit you perfectly," she said, her voice syrupy and brittle. She dropped the menu onto the table, the sound echoing like a slap. Shaq pulled out the chair with the gentleness of a man handling an old record. He sat down, folded his hands, and looked up at her. "Thank you," he said simply. Emma tilted her head, waiting for a protest, a flicker of shame, something. But Shaq only looked at her, his eyes warm and deep, the calm of a mountain after a storm. Around them, the air grew heavy. A young woman in a red dress leaned forward, her eyes sharp with disapproval. An elderly man adjusted his glasses, his mouth tightening. Emma turned abruptly and marched away, her spine rigid, her pride wrapped tight around her like a suffocating cloak. Shaq opened the menu slowly, as if he were opening a letter from an old friend. He traced the names of the dishes with a curious finger, his expression serene. Somewhere in the background, the jazz band played a lonely, winding tune, each note lingering in the air like a held breath. Shaq set the menu down. He wasn't here for the steak or the wine. He was here for something none of them could yet see. And tonight, every soul in that glittering room was about to learn that true power doesn't need to shout. It only needs to stand still and watch the world reveal itself. Emma stood at the bar, her fingers drumming against the polished wood like a ticking clock. Her eyes kept darting to the corner where Shaq sat, a quiet island in a sea of murmurs and stolen glances. She leaned toward Jake, a young server with kind eyes and a nervous edge. "Did you see him?" she hissed, her voice dripping with disdain. "He thinks he belongs here. Can you imagine?" Jake shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking toward Shaq and then back to the floor. "Maybe he just wants to enjoy a good meal," he mumbled. Emma scoffed, tossing her hair back with an exaggerated flick. "People like that don't come here for the food. They come to play pretend, to feel important for a night." At a nearby table, Lisa Jenkins set down her wine glass a little too hard. The sound cut through the room, making a few heads turn. Her eyes, sharp as broken glass, stayed locked on Emma. "He's done nothing wrong," Lisa whispered to her companion, her voice tight with anger. "She's humiliating him for no reason." Her friend nodded, brows drawn tight. "It's disgusting. Someone should say something." But no one did. The silence felt like a thick fog, clinging to every face and every heartbeat. Emma watched Shaq from across the room, her lips curling into a smirk. She picked up a fresh menu and strutted toward him, each step sharp and deliberate. She dropped the menu in front of him, leaning down slightly. Her voice was soft enough to sound polite, but her words cut deeper than any blade. "Would you like me to explain the prices to you?" she asked, her eyes gleaming with mock concern. "The most expensive dish here is $350, just so there are no surprises." Shaq looked up slowly. A faint smile played at the corners of his mouth, gentle and immovable. "I'll have the filet mignon Rossini," he said, his tone calm as moonlight. Emma's face twitched. For a moment, her mask cracked, and something raw and bitter flickered behind her eyes. "Oh," she crooned, her voice trembling under the weight of her forced sweetness. "I hope you can truly appreciate it. This isn't your usual burger joint." Nearby, forks hovered in midair. A man in a dark blue suit turned to his partner, shaking his head slowly. "This is shameful," he murmured. "He's handling it better than any of us would." Shaq inclined his head slightly, unbothered, as if he were listening to a quiet song only he could hear. "Thank you," he replied simply, his voice a soft echo in the charged air. "I look forward to it." Emma straightened up, her knuckles white as she gripped the menu. She turned sharply and walked away, her steps pounding like war drums across the polished floor. Behind her, whispers curled through the room like rising smoke. "He's so composed," Lisa breathed, her eyes wet with frustration. "She's trying to break him, but she can't even scratch the surface." An older gentleman at the center table, Mr. William Carter, set his glass down with a quiet clink. He leaned toward his wife, his voice low and reverent. "That man is teaching her a lesson she won't find in any textbook," he said, eyes fixed on Shaq's still figure. Emma disappeared behind the bar, her breath ragged, her pride splintering in small, invisible cracks. In the corner, Shaq sat alone, his fingers tracing the rim of his water glass. Each movement was deliberate, as if he were sculpting the silence around him. Tonight wasn't about a meal. It wasn't about fine wine or fancy chandeliers. Tonight was about a woman's pride crashing against an immovable spirit. And every pair of eyes in La Lumiere was about to learn what real strength looked like when it didn't need to raise its voice. Emma leaned against the service counter, her breath short and sharp, her fingers drumming an angry rhythm on the steel edge. She glared at the kitchen doors as if they alone carried her frustration. Jake approached cautiously, holding a tray stacked with empty glasses. He hesitated, his voice soft. "Emma, maybe you should just let it go. He hasn't done anything wrong." Emma's head snapped toward him, her eyes flashing like broken mirrors. "Let it go," she spat. "Do you know what this place stands for? Class, elegance, exclusivity, people like him." "They don't belong here." Jake flinched, his gaze dropping to the floor. He didn't respond. Instead, he drifted away, his shoulders rounded under the weight of words he couldn't swallow. Meanwhile, in the far corner, Shaq sat motionless. The jazz band had started a new tune, a slow, haunting melody that curled through the air like smoke. Shaq's fingers tapped gently on the table, in sync with the double bass, as if he were keeping time with the heartbeat of the room itself. Lisa shifted in her seat, her jaw clenched so tightly it trembled. She leaned toward her friend, her whisper urgent and low. "Why isn't anyone stopping her? Why is everyone just watching?" Her friend shook her head, eyes dark with shared shame. "Because silence is easier," she whispered back. "But look at him, he doesn't need us. He's stronger than we'll ever be." At the center table, Mr. Carter watched Shaq with an intensity that felt almost holy. He raised his wine glass slowly, as if in silent tribute, then set it down, his fingers lingering on the stem. Across the room, Emma grabbed a fresh water pitcher and marched back toward Shaq's table, each step louder than the last. She slammed the pitcher down, water sloshing dangerously close to the edge. "Would you like more water?" she asked, her voice a weapon dressed as courtesy. Shaq looked up, his gaze unwavering, his breath steady. "Yes, please," he replied, his voice smooth as river stones. Emma poured, her hand shaking, droplets splattering onto the white linen like tiny, angry tears. He nodded in thanks, lifting his glass carefully, his fingers large yet gentle, as if cradling something sacred. Emma stood frozen, waiting, her eyes hungry for a crack in his armor. But there was none. Only that quiet, impenetrable grace that filled every inch of him. Suddenly, from the far side of the room, a single pair of hands began to clap. The sound cut through the thick air, sharp and clear. The jazz band paused, notes hanging unfinished in the air. A woman near the stage rose to her feet, her hands continuing their steady applause. Slowly, hesitantly, another guest joined in, then another. The sound swelled, awkward and raw at first, then stronger, rippling through the room like a sudden summer storm. Emma's eyes darted around, panic rising in her throat. Her cheeks burned as every face turned toward her, some cold, some pitying, but all united in silent judgment. Shaq set his glass down, folding his hands again, his face soft, almost sorrowful. This wasn't a victory he wanted. This was a lesson unfolding in real time, a mirror held up to every heart in that room. Emma spun on her heel and fled toward the bar, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Shaq sat alone, his eyes closed for a moment, listening to the last echo of claps fade into the low hum of conversation. Tonight wasn't about her cruelty or his patience. It was about the quiet power that lives in stillness, the kind that doesn't demand attention but commands it simply by existing. And tonight, everyone at La Lumiere had no choice but to see it. A hushed murmur rolled through La Lumiere like a tide rising under moonlight. Forks clinked softly against plates, wine glasses trembled in hesitant hands. Every guest leaned in, eyes darting to the corner where Shaq sat, a silent sentinel in the glow of the chandeliers. Lisa's fingers twisted around her napkin, her knuckles white. She leaned forward, her eyes ablaze. "Do you see this?" she hissed to her friend. "Everyone just sits here, watching like we're at a play." Her friend swallowed hard, her eyes flicking toward Shaq's table and then back to Lisa. "He's not even trying to defend himself," she whispered. He doesn't need to. He's making her unravel on her own. At the center table, Mr. Carter set his knife down, the silver glinting under the golden lights. He glanced at his wife, his eyes heavy with both sadness and admiration. He's teaching us all, Mr. Carter murmured, his voice low, a confession more than a statement. Without a word, he's turning this entire room inside out. Mrs. Carter nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on Shaq. I've never seen dignity used like a weapon, she whispered, her voice shaking. Near the bar, Emma wiped her hands over and over on her apron as if she could scrub away the heat rising up her neck. Her reflection in the polished counter stared back, each line on her face more defined under the harsh lights. Jake stepped forward cautiously, his voice almost too soft to hear. Emma, maybe you should apologize, he suggested, his eyes kind but firm. Emma jerked her head toward him, her eyes wide, pupils dark as storm clouds. Apologize to him. For what? She snapped, her voice brittle as glass. Jake swallowed, shifting from foot to foot. For treating him like he's less. You know he didn't deserve that. Emma's mouth opened, but no words came out, her breath hitched, her eyes darting back toward Shaq. He sat perfectly still, his hands resting on the table, his gaze lifted slightly as if he were studying the ceiling, or maybe something far beyond it. Across the room, the jazz band began again, hesitant at first, the saxophone sighing like a tired soul. Slowly, the notes grew, weaving through the heavy air, trying to stitch the tension back together. Lisa rose from her seat, her movements sharp and decisive. Her heels clicked against the marble floor as she took a step forward. But she paused, catching Shaq's gaze. For a moment, it felt as though the entire room held its breath. His eyes met hers, soft and patient, an unspoken request to stay. She stopped, her fists slowly unclenching. She lowered her gaze, breathing out a long, trembling sigh as she sank back into her chair. At the center table, Mr. Carter's eyes glistened. He raised his glass again, but this time it was not a toast to power or money or polished surfaces. It was a silent tribute to the quietest kind of strength. Emma stood frozen, her fingers pressed so hard into the counter that her nails turned pale. Her chest rose and fell in short, uneven bursts. Shaq remained, unmoving, a mountain beneath a storm. The band played on, each note a fragile thread trying to bind a room that had already been split open. Tonight, La Lumiere wasn't just a restaurant. It was a mirror. Every guest, every server, every hidden thought laid bare under the glittering lights. And somewhere deep inside, even Emma felt the first crack in the armor she had worn her entire life. The kitchen doors swung open with a quiet whoosh, and out stepped Michael Thompson, the manager of La Lumiere. His tailored suit clung to him like a second skin, but his face carried lines that no fabric could hide. Worry etched itself deep into his brow as he scanned the room, his eyes locking onto the corner where Shaq sat. Guests turned one by one, a silent wave of curiosity rippling across the dining hall. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The clink of cutlery vanished. It was as if the entire restaurant had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. Michael moved quickly but gracefully, weaving through the tables, his polished shoes gliding across the marble. When he reached Shaq's table, he paused, his hand resting lightly on the back of the empty chair across from him. "Mr. O'Neal," Michael said, his voice low but trembling at the edges. We had no idea you were joining us tonight. Please accept my sincerest apologies for your experience." The words dropped into the silence like a stone into still water. The ripple was immediate. Gasps, soft and sharp, darted across the room. Eyes widened, hands flew to mouths, and the hush transformed into stunned electricity. Emma's knees buckled slightly. Her hand shot out to grab the edge of the counter, her fingers clawing at the wood as if she were trying to hold on to the last pieces of her pride. Jake turned toward her, his eyes wide in shock. His lips parted, but no words emerged. Shaq looked up at Michael, his expression gentle, almost tender, as if he were comforting an old friend instead of confronting an entire room. "It's okay," Shaq said, his voice calm and rich, each word a soft chord. "I came here for a quiet dinner, nothing more." Michael swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. He glanced briefly at Emma, whose face had drained of color. "Sir, please." Michael continued, his voice breaking slightly. "Let us move you to a better table. You deserve better than this." Shaq shook his head slowly, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "This table is fine," he replied, his tone so gentle it carried more weight than any raised voice could. A heavy silence settled once more, but it was no longer charged with mockery. Now it trembled with guilt, shame, and something raw that hovered just below the surface. Emma pressed her free hand to her chest, her breathing shallow. She felt every eye on her like knives against her skin. Her own voice echoed in her mind, each cruel word she had thrown now returning to her, sharper than any blade. Lisa watched, tears brimming in her eyes. She covered her mouth with one trembling hand, her shoulders quaking with silent outrage and relief all at once. "Mr." Carter leaned back in his chair, a long breath leaving his lungs as though he had been holding it for years. He looked at his wife, his voice barely a whisper. "He didn't even need to reveal himself," he said, "but now they all see him." Mrs. Carter nodded, her eyes glassy, her fingers reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. Michael bowed his head slightly toward Shaq, his shoulders sagging with both relief and regret. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice hushed. "Thank you for your patience and your grace." Shaq inclined his head, a single nod that felt like the final note in a long, unfinished song. Emma staggered backward, her back pressing against the counter, her eyes darting helplessly across the room. Everywhere she looked, she saw judgment. Everywhere she turned, she found her own reflection staring back, twisted and ugly. And in that moment, under the glittering chandeliers and the weight of her own choices, Emma Carter finally began to understand the true meaning of respect and the quiet, devastating power of a man who didn't need to raise his voice to change an entire world. Shaq placed his glass of water gently on the table, the soft clink echoing like a heartbeat in the breathless room. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his full height, towering above every whispered rumor and hidden judgment that clung to the air. He turned to face Emma first. Her eyes were wide, her lips parted, her hands trembling at her sides like leaves in a cold wind. "Miss Carter," he began, his voice calm, low, yet heavy enough to fill every shadowed corner of the restaurant. "How do you think a guest should be treated?" Emma's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her gaze flickered to Michael, to the other guests, then back to Shaq. Her throat worked around words that refused to form. Shaq didn't move closer. He didn't need to, his presence alone stretched across the space, a quiet gravity pulling every heart toward him. "You don't need to know someone's name to show them respect," he continued, each word measured and gentle but sharper than any blade. "Respect is not a gift we give based on what we see. It is the foundation of every human connection." A soft sob escaped from somewhere in the room. Mrs. Carter clutched her husband's hand, tears welling up in her eyes. Emma pressed her hand to her chest, her fingers splayed as if trying to steady a storm inside her ribs. Shaq turned, his gaze sweeping slowly over every table, every face. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed. The kind of disappointment that makes the ground tremble under your feet. "We live in a world quick to judge," he said, his voice like a low thunder rolling over a silent field. "Quick to decide who belongs and who doesn't. But if you measure someone's worth by their clothes, their shoes, or their wallet, you lose the chance to see their soul." A young woman near the bar wiped tears from her cheeks with the back of her hand. The jazz band had gone still, instruments resting quietly as though they, too, were listening. Shaq paused, letting the silence fill the space between each word. "I came here tonight for a meal," he said softly, his eyes returning to Emma. "But I found something else, an opportunity to remind us all that dignity doesn't wear a price tag." Emma's knees buckled. She grabbed the counter behind her, her shoulders shaking. Her face crumpled as if every harsh word she had ever spoken had come home to roost all at once. Shaq watched her, his gaze unwavering but not cruel. "You have a choice tonight," he said, his voice softer now, almost tender. "You can stay in this armor you've built for yourself, or you can step out of it and learn what it really means to serve not just food but humanity." A sharp inhale cut across the room. Mr. Carter's eyes glistened, his lips trembling. He turned to his wife, who nodded, tears slipping down her face like quiet confessions. Emma let out a broken breath, her hands moving to cover her face as a sob burst from her lips. Shaq nodded slowly, his head bowing slightly, as though he were offering a blessing rather than a verdict. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. "It's about all of us. We can't change the world if we refuse to see each other." He turned, his shoulders broad but relaxed, his steps silent as he returned to his table. And in that quiet return, something shifted. The room felt lighter, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. Emma slid down to the floor behind the counter, her sobs echoing like fragile thunder. Tonight, Shaq didn't break her. He handed her the mirror. And for the first time, she was forced to see her own reflection. Emma's breath came in jagged waves, her shoulders trembling as though they carried centuries of storms. Her fingers dug into the edge of the counter behind her, her knuckles pale, her face hidden behind trembling hands. Jake stepped closer, his eyes wide with worry and something softer, an unspoken invitation to step out of her prison. "Emma," he whispered, his voice almost a prayer. "Say something. It's not too late." She shook her head violently at first, her hair falling loose from its perfect bun, strands clinging to her tear-soaked cheeks. But then, as if the last brittle layer of pride finally cracked, she lifted her head. Her eyes were red, swollen, wild, and fragile all at once. She pushed herself upright, her legs shaking beneath her. Slowly, unsteadily, she stepped out from behind the counter. Every face turned toward her, some curious, some brimming with quiet mercy, some holding back tears. She took a deep breath, her lips parting, her voice emerging raw and unsteady. "I'm sorry," she said, the words falling into the silent room like shattered glass. I was wrong." Her voice cracked, her chest heaving. "I thought I was protecting something, this image, this standard, but I was only protecting my own fear, my own weakness." She looked at Shaq, who sat quietly, his gaze calm, patient, an ocean that could hold any storm. "You didn't deserve any of it," she continued, her words stumbling out like wounded birds. "None of you did." A soft gasp broke from Lisa's table. Tears slipped down Lisa's cheeks as she clutched her friend's hand, nodding vigorously, urging Emma on with silent strength. Emma pressed her hand to her chest, as if trying to stop her heart from splitting open. "I lost myself," she whispered. "I forgot that respect is not something to be earned with money or clothes. It's something we owe each other simply because we're human." Her shoulders collapsed forward, and a sob rattled through her ribs. But this time, it was not the sob of shame alone. It was the sob of release, of something finally breaking free. "Mister." Carter leaned back in his chair, his eyes shining. He reached for his wife's hand, squeezing it gently, as if to anchor himself to this moment of raw, fragile humanity. Emma's knees buckled again, but she caught herself, standing up straighter than she had all evening. "I promise," she choked out. "I will change. I don't know how yet, but I will." Shaq's eyes softened even more. He inclined his head, not as a king to a subject, but as a fellow human acknowledging another's courage. Around the room, a hush deeper than any silence before spread like a balm. In that moment, the chandeliers seemed to glow a little softer, the walls seemed to breathe. Emma wiped her face, her fingers trembling. She looked out at the guests, each face reflecting a piece of her broken armor, each pair of eyes holding a flicker of unexpected grace. She stepped back slowly, finding her balance for the first time in years. In that fragile, trembling apology, she became more than an employee, more than a woman caught in her own pride. She became human again. And in that humanity, she found the first fragile threads of redemption waiting for her trembling hands to weave them into something real. After the last guests drifted into the night, La Lumiere stood quiet, the chandeliers humming like distant stars in a moonless sky. The staff gathered in a loose circle in the center of the dining room, their eyes heavy with exhaustion and something deeper, a trembling anticipation. Shaq stood at the heart of the circle, his presence a calm lighthouse in the restless sea of shifting feet and lowered gazes. He scanned each face slowly, not with judgment, but with the weight of someone seeing straight through to the marrow. Emma stood slightly apart, her hands clasped tight, her face pale but resolute. Jake stood next to her, his fingers flexing at his sides like a silent encouragement. Shaq cleared his throat softly, the sound echoing like a low drumbeat in the empty hall. "We all saw what happened tonight," he began, his voice low, each word sinking deep. "And maybe, for some of you, it felt like a storm you didn't ask for." He paused, letting the silence ripple outward. No one dared move. "But storms wash things clean," he continued, his tone gentle, each syllable threaded with hope. "They reveal what's beneath the dust we've let settle for too long." A hush fell thicker. Emma's breath came in slow, uneven pulls, but her eyes stayed fixed on him, open and raw. Shaq turned slightly, sweeping his gaze across the young servers, the cooks peeking from the kitchen doorway, the bar staff huddled near the counter. "This place," he said, gesturing with a quiet sweep of his hand, "is not just a restaurant. It's a living story. Every guest who walks in is a page, every interaction a sentence." Jake swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, his eyes shining under the soft lights. "And you," Shaq continued, his voice firm but kind, "are the writers. You decide whether that story ends with pride or with compassion." Emma let out a shaky breath, her shoulders dropping as though a mountain had slid from her back. Shaq took a small step forward. "Tonight wasn't about me," he said softly. "It was about what we carry into every room we enter, our fears, our assumptions, and the walls we build to protect ourselves from each other." A quiet sniffle came from the edge of the circle. A young dishwasher wiped his nose on his sleeve, his cheeks blotchy, eyes wide and wet. Shaq looked at Emma then, his gaze holding hers like steady hands. "You showed courage tonight," he said, his words softer now, like a father's hand smoothing a child's hair. "Not because you were perfect, but because you chose to stand in your own truth, however painful." Emma's lips trembled. She nodded, her hands tightening around each other. Shaq turned back to the staff. "All of us can learn from this. Every one of us has armor we think we need. But sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is to take it off." The room seemed to breathe, each person inhaling that possibility as though for the first time. Jake's fingers curled into a fist at his side. He nodded to himself, a small, quiet promise. Shaq stepped back, his shoulders relaxing as though he had finally set down a heavy load. "I believe in you all," he said, his voice carrying the weight of an ocean and the softness of a lullaby. "Change starts small, in the way you greet someone, in the way you choose kindness when no one is watching." Emma finally exhaled a long, shaky breath, and in that fragile sound, there was the first echo of something new, a seed taking root. La Lumiere was no longer just a stage for meals and quiet pretensions. Tonight, it had become a place of quiet revolutions, stitched together by trembling apologies and silent, steadfast strength. And for the first time, in the hush that settled over the circle, each soul felt what it meant to start over together. Shaq stepped out into the night, the door of La Lumiere closing behind him with a soft sigh, like an exhale after holding in too much for too long. The moon hung above Beverly Hills, a pale guardian in the velvet sky, spilling gentle light onto the quiet, empty streets. He walked slowly, each step a quiet meditation. His shadow stretched ahead, long and patient as if it too were lost in thought. The air tasted different outside, cleaner, simpler. The hush of passing cars drifted by like waves on a distant shore. Shaq tilted his head back, his eyes tracing the scattered stars above. Memories drifted to the surface, each one a ripple in his still mind. He remembered roaring stadiums, the echo of a ball against the hardwood, the crowd's thunderous approval that used to define him. He remembered the nights when anger felt like the only armor, when silence was mistaken for weakness. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he carried no ball, no jersey, no spotlight. Only the weight of a lesson, offered freely, not forced. He paused at a street corner, his fingers brushing lightly against a lamppost. Its metal felt cool, steady. He glanced back over his shoulder at La Lumiere, now just a warm glow among the dark outlines of the city. In that glow, he saw not a restaurant, but a beating heart, trembling, imperfect, alive. A gentle breeze drifted past, tugging at the hem of his shirt, carrying with it the faint scent of rosemary and wine, echoes of a place transformed. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the memories flood him. Emma's tearful apology, Jake's quiet promise, The trembling hands, the uncertain stares melting into something softer, something open. He breathed deeply, each inhale a small vow to himself. It was never about revenge, he thought, never about winning or proving a point. It was always about planting something small, something almost invisible, a seed of respect, of kindness that might one day break the stone and bloom. He turned his gaze forward again, his mouth curling into a small, knowing smile. "We all have our lights," he murmured, his voice low, almost swallowed by the breeze. "Sometimes we just need to remember how to turn them on." He stepped off the curb, his stride slow but sure. Ahead of him, the street stretched out like an unwritten page, the night whispering promises only he could hear. And as he walked deeper into the quiet city, each step seemed to echo not with the sound of shoes on concrete, but with the silent music of a man who knew exactly who he was, and who carried that truth as lightly as the stars carried the night. Morning light spilled over Beverly Hills, catching on the glass doors of La Lumiere like a quiet blessing. The restaurant stood still for a moment, as if taking a deep breath before the day began. Inside, the staff moved through the space with a gentleness that felt new, like touching a piano key for the first time after years of silence. Emma stood at the host's stand, her uniform pressed, her hair pulled back into a simple ponytail. No armor today, just her. Her eyes held a softness that hadn't been there before, a quiet humility that glowed even brighter than any chandelier. Jake polished glasses at the bar, his movements smooth and focused. He paused every so often to glance at Emma, his lips curving into small, silent encouragements. "Mr." Thompson walked the floor, stopping to check each table, his fingers brushing over the linen like an artist inspecting a blank canvas. When he reached Emma, he paused. She looked up, their eyes meeting in a quiet conversation that needed no words. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. She returned it, her lips trembling with the smallest, truest smile. Guests began to arrive, stepping inside with curious eyes. But today the atmosphere felt different, less like a gallery of hushed judgments, more like a sanctuary. Emma greeted each guest with a warmth that seemed to pour directly from her chest, her voice softer, her hands steady. She looked people in the eye, each, welcome, carrying the weight of her own transformation. Lisa returned that afternoon, slipping into a seat near the window. She watched Emma move around the room, her eyes shimmering with something between pride and relief. Mr. Carter and his wife came again too, settling at their usual table. They exchanged a knowing look as Emma approached, her head bowed slightly in respect. "Welcome back," she said, her voice low but clear. "It's good to see you, Mrs." Carter reached out, her fingertips brushing Emma's hand for a fleeting moment. A silent absolution, a shared promise. The jazz band set up in the corner, tuning their instruments. When they began to play, the music felt lighter, carried by the laughter and warmth weaving through the room like threads of gold. Emma turned to look at the door, her gaze drifting beyond the walls, as if searching for a towering shadow that wouldn't be returning tonight. But in her eyes, there was no regret, only gratitude. She pressed a hand gently to her chest, inhaling deeply, as if savoring the fragile, miraculous gift of beginning again. Around her, the staff moved like a single breath, each person more connected, more alive. Plates glided from kitchen to table, glasses chimed with new stories, and smiles bloomed in unexpected corners. Emma looked out at the dining room, her eyes lingering on every guest, every soft laugh, every hand reaching for another's. She took a step forward, her voice steady, her heart loud in her chest. "This is a new beginning," she whispered to herself, the words tasting both heavy and sweet. And as the golden afternoon light poured through the windows, La Lumiere no longer shone merely with chandeliers and polished silver. It glowed with something far rarer, a collective promise that respect and kindness would no longer be optional, but the foundation on which every dish, every welcome, and every quiet moment would be built.